I discovered that the man I loved most in my life was also the man I should have hated the most. He saved me when I was dying. He literally carried me away from death. We became brothers that night in Stalingrad, and I lived for 70 years honoring his sacrifice. Every act of kindness, every moment of integrity. It was all a way of paying my debt to Hans. But when I received his letter, I discovered that his hands, the same hands that brought me water, had taken my brother from me. And worse, Hans had spent his entire life keeping this secret, trying to make up for what was uncompensatable. And then I discovered the truth that destroyed everything and rebuilt my understanding of forgiveness. You need to see this to the end, because this isn't a war story. It's a story about how humanity exists in the darkest places, how sometimes the enemy saves us, and how sometimes forgiving is the hardest and most necessary thing we can do. Stay with me, subscribe, and let's find out together if there is forgiveness for someone like Hans. My name is Jakob. I am 95 years old, and for 70 years, I have kept a secret that isn't mine, but that has become as much a part of me as my own heart. So heavy, so necessary, so impossible to let go of. The room is silent. Just the sound of the wall clock, the one Nina bought in 1952, and that has never stopped. Not even when she left. Not even when it should have stopped with me. I sit in this armchair, the same one where she used to fall asleep reading, the same one where I pretended to sleep so I wouldn't hear my own thoughts. And today, finally, I am letting the words come out. This isn't a story about my guilt. Let me be clear about that. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't betray anyone. But I carry the gratitude of someone who was saved by an enemy. And that gratitude is a chain I've never been able to break. I was dying in Stalingrad, wounded, alone. The snow burned like fire. My comrades had already left, not out of cruelty, but because war leaves no room for heroism. War just chooses who stays. And I stayed, lying in the darkness, waiting for the end, thinking of my mother, of my brother David, thinking about how strange it is to die when you're still too young to understand you're dying. Then I heard the footsteps, German soldiers' footsteps, heavy in the snow, and I thought, this is the end. Now it will be quick. Thank God it will be quick. But it wasn't. A man knelt beside me. A German. Young. Maybe a few years older than me. And instead of executing a prisoner, he carried me. On his shoulders. Kilometer after kilometer in the darkness. Bleeding with me. Breathing with me. He put me in a shelter. Brought me water. Water. While men were dying for lack of it, this enemy was giving me water. His name was Hans. For 70 years, I have lived because of his action. Every day I woke up, it was because Hans chose to save me. Every meal I ate with my family, it was because Hans brought me water that night. Every child I had, every grandchild I met, they all exist because Hans decided I deserve to live. This is not a small thing. This isn't just gratitude. It's a debt that has no currency. It's a life built on the gift of another man. But the debt warps you. It changes you internally. You live as if you're always paying something you can never fully repay. And you never tell anyone. Because how do you explain it? How do you tell your wife, I love you because a German soldier saved me from death? How do you tell your children, I live with dignity because an enemy chose compassion? Nina never knew. She knew I was reserved, that I had nightmares, that I woke up screaming in the middle of the night. But she never knew why. How could she? How could I explain that the man I had secretly loved for 70 years wore a German uniform? How could I say that gratitude can be lonelier than guilt? So I lived. I built a house. I worked as a carpenter. I helped neighbors. I went to church. I did every act as if I were paying the debt to Hans, even though he would never know, even though I would never see him again. Until in October 2014, a mailman rang my doorbell. A letter from Berlin. That was 11 years ago. And with that letter, everything I had built to forget collapsed in minutes. The entire life I had lived in the shadow of a secret was illuminated, not by redemption, but by something much, much worse. But that is another silence, the one I am still trying to learn to breathe through. I was 23 years old. It seems impossible to say that now, at 95, as if I were talking about a different person, a different body, a different soul. But it was me. It was Jakob, too young to understand that death doesn't ask about age. Stalingrad. I still hear that name and feel the cold in my bone marrow. It's not a memory. It's a reminiscence. It's as if that cold settled permanently somewhere deep inside me, and every winter it wakes up. The battle lasted 199 days. I spent 187 of them waiting to die. You can't understand Stalingrad if you've never been there. No word is big enough. No image is dark enough. It was as if the city itself had become a living cemetery. Walls that wouldn't fall completely, just remained standing to bear witness. Streets that were mass graves. Men who would fall, and you wouldn't stop because stopping meant dying too. The cold. Let me tell you about the cold. It's not like the cold you feel at home, waiting for spring. This was a cold that burned, that disfigured. Your fingers would turn purple. Your lips would start to bleed. Your eyes would water and the tears would freeze on your face, freeze so fast you could barely blink. And the hunger. God, the hunger was worse than the cold. Because the cold numbed you. The hunger ate you from the inside out. You could feel your own body decomposing while you were still alive. On January 23, 1944, I was with my squad, or what was left of it. 8 men. We had been 30 just days before. The others were left behind in nameless streets, in buildings that no longer had walls. We were in a destroyed warehouse, surrounded by rubble, no ammunition, with wounds that none of us should have survived. One of the boys, Yuri, I think it was coughing up blood, pure blood, as if his lungs were leaving his body. Our commander said, "You head north, try to reach the Soviet lines." It wasn't an order. It was a farewell. We walked, or tried to walk. I had a wound in my leg. A bullet had gone straight through, leaving a hole that wouldn't close. My shoulder had been dislocated from an explosion 2 days earlier. I couldn't lift my right arm. But you keep going. Death is everywhere, so you just choose the death that comes from speed instead of inertia. After an hour, it was just me and Dmitri. Dmitri was from Ukraine. He had a son. He talked about his son constantly. My Maxim is 5 years old, as if repeating it could guarantee Dmitri would return to see him grow up. Dmitri fell. He just fell. And he looked at me with a face that held no fear. It held relief. Relief because he could finally stop. "Go," he whispered. "Go, Jakob. Live for us." I left him. That was the moment I began to die. Not physically, but morally, existentially. Because you carry that. You carry Dmitri and all the others, and you live because they couldn't. I walked alone. I have no idea for how long. Hours. A night. The darkness was complete. The streets of Stalingrad at night were tunnels between ruins. And the cold was so intense that my body stopped shaking. When your body stops shaking, you know you're near the end. It's like life is leaving. I fell. I just couldn't walk anymore. My knees gave out and I fell onto the snow. Snow that was pure, white, deceitful in its beauty. I lay there, and I began to think. Not about survival, about goodbyes. My mother, my brother David. I wanted them to know, but there were no words. There was nothing. Just the silence and the cold that finally, mercifully, was beginning to feel warm. I closed my eyes, and then I heard the footsteps. Boot steps, heavy, regular, German. The footsteps stopped. He was looking at me. A German soldier standing above me, a silhouette against the even darker darkness. I knew what was coming. I knew because I had seen it happen hundreds of times. A fallen prisoner, an enemy. The solution was always the same, a bullet. Quick, efficient, protocol. I closed my eyes, but the bullet didn't come. Instead, I heard a sound I didn't expect to hear that night. The sound of a man kneeling, not a soldier. A man. His knees broke the icy crust of the snow, and when I opened my eyes, I saw his face. He was maybe 26. He had a grown-out beard. He had eyes that... I can't describe those eyes without crying. 70 years later, and I can still see them. They were blue, tired, filled with something that wasn't hatred. "You are wounded," he said, in Russian, with a heavy German accent. But he said it. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because something was happening that violated every rule of war I had learned. An enemy doesn't treat you with compassion. An enemy doesn't kneel. He removed my coat. He saw the wound in my leg, saw the dislocated shoulder, and instead of executing me, he began to work, carefully, with a delicacy I didn't expect from German hands. He popped my shoulder back into place. I screamed. God, I screamed so loud my voice was lost in the night. And he just whispered, I know, I'm sorry. Then he picked me up. Not like a soldier would pick up a prisoner, like a brother would pick up a brother. He put me on his shoulders, and he began to walk, kilometer after kilometer, in the complete darkness, through streets that had no end, and I could feel him bleeding too, a wound in his side that he had opened by carrying me. Two wounded men, bleeding together, walking to nowhere in particular. Just walking. What's your name? I asked. Hans. Just Hans. As if a name could contain humanity. We reached a shelter, a partially destroyed building with a cellar where there was still residual heat from something that had burned days before. Hans set me down gently, and then he did something that still haunts me. He left. He left completely, and he came back with water. Water. You can't understand what water means when you're on the verge of death. It's not just water. It's life. It's the difference between giving up and going on. And Hans brought me that difference. That night, we didn't talk about war. We didn't talk about soldiers. We didn't talk about Germany or Russia. We talked like two men who were tired. Hans took a picture from his pocket. His mother, Margaret. Light eyes. A smile that spoke of a world that no longer exists. She doesn't know what I've done, Hans said. What I still have to do. I showed him my picture. David, my brother, protective, brave. He doesn't know where I am, I replied, if I'm coming back. Hans shared a cigarette with me. Smoke that burned, hot, alive. We smoked in silence. And in that silence, something happened that had no name. Two enemies became men, and two men became brothers. In the morning, Hans said they had to leave, that there were checks, that he couldn't be found with me, that there were reasons that went beyond compassion, reasons that were bigger than us. Before he left, he hugged me, tightly, as if he wanted to transfer his strength to me, and he whispered something in my ear that would echo for 7 decades. Forgive me for what we have to do. I didn't understand, not at the time, but those words, that strange phrase. It was as if Hans was apologizing to me in advance for something I didn't yet know had happened. It was as if he already knew. Hans came back on the second day. I didn't know if he would. I spent the whole night awake, waiting to hear footsteps, waiting for the whole thing to have been a dream. An enemy's compassion, the water, the hug. Things that don't exist in war. Things that are luxuries for people who aren't dying. But he came back. He brought food, hard bread, a bit of meat I didn't want to know the origin of, and more water. Always more water. As if it were possible to make up for 70 years of drought with a few days of generosity. You're better, he said. It wasn't true, but I understood. He wasn't talking about my body. He was talking about my will to live. And that was true. I wanted to live now. Before, in the snow, I was ready to give up. Now, in Hans's presence, I wanted to survive. I wanted to go home. I wanted to see him again. In those 3 days, I have no idea if it was really 3 or if my memory stretched them to seem more significant. We lived an entire lifetime. Hans talked about music. He played the violin before the war. He didn't play anymore. My hands, he said, looking at his palms as if they were strangers. My hands have learned things that music could never forgive. I didn't completely understand, but I understood regret. I talked about David, about how my brother used to take me for walks when I was a child, how he taught me to fight, to work, to be a man. He's brave, I said, but fair. Hans looked at me with an expression I can't name, something between longing and remorse. The brave men suffer more, he whispered. On the second day, Hans brought something else. A small bottle of alcohol, vodka, I think, or maybe brandy. It didn't matter. It was warmth. It was forgetting for a few hours. We drank together. Not much. Just enough to let us talk about things soldiers shouldn't talk about. Are you afraid? I asked. He took a long time to answer. Every day, he finally said. Every day I'm afraid. Afraid of living. Afraid of dying. Afraid of what I still have to do. Those words again. That promise of something still to come. Something Hans already knew he would do, and that would affect me. But I didn't ask. Because asking meant accepting that Hans had secrets, and I didn't want to know. I wanted to believe that this man kneeling beside me, sharing his vodka with me, was just a man, not a soldier, not an enemy, just a tired man who had chosen compassion. On the third day, Hans did something that marked me for life. He planned our future. When the war is over, he said with an urgency, as if there wasn't enough time in the hours we had. When the war is over, you'll come to Berlin. You'll come see me. We'll have a toast with my mother. She'll make apple cake. You've never had apple cake like that. I just listened, knowing it was impossible, knowing it was too beautiful to be true, but letting the impossible live in my heart. How would I find you? I asked. You'll find me, he said, as if it were a promise he could guarantee, as if love could overcome geography, politics, the war itself. That afternoon, I heard the first nearby shots. Not the distant shots that marked the battle, but shots that were getting closer, fast. Hans stood up. His eyes changed. The man who had been my brother in that small cellar disappeared. A soldier returned. They're going to find you, he said. Soviet soldiers. You'll be rescued. And you? I asked. He didn't answer. He just kissed my forehead. Like a brother. Like a father. Like someone who knows they will never see you again and wants to leave that kiss as a permanent mark. Live for me, Jacob, he whispered. Live well. Live as if I am living through you. I swear I promised. Minutes later, the door was broken down. Soviet soldiers, my comrades, my liberation. Hans raised his hands. There was an order, a hierarchy, a protocol that said he was the enemy again. And in that instant, when I saw Hans turn to the wall, when I saw the rifle pointed at the back of his neck, I understood with a clarity that would never leave me. I would never see him again. I was liberated that day, carried away from Hans, away from the cellar, away from the only place in Stalingrad where I had found humanity. The Soviet soldiers put me on a makeshift stretcher. They asked my name. They asked about my wounds. No one asked about the German I had left behind. No one asked about things like that. In the following months, the war continued. I recovered physically. My leg healed. My shoulder learned to work again. But something in me had been permanently altered in that cellar. I was no longer just Jakob. I was Jakob who had been saved. Jakob who should have been dead. Jakob who was living the life of a man who had chosen compassion when he could have chosen protocol. I had made a promise. Live for me, Hans had said. And I lived. Not for me. For him. When the war ended in 1945, I had nowhere to go. Stalingrad was destruction. Russia was chaos. So I moved to Brazil, a place where no one knew my name, a place where I could start over, a place where I could, perhaps, honor the life Hans had given me. I married Nina in 1946. She was a good woman, simple, no questions about my past. She saw a man who worked hard, a man who didn't complain, a man who seemed to be trying to make up for something invisible every day. She didn't need to know about Hans. She just needed to accept that I lived as if I were paying a debt that would never end. We had children, 3, and every one of them was a gift from Hans, because without Hans, they wouldn't exist. My work as a carpenter, building houses, fixing furniture, creating things with my hands, was a way of honoring that soldier who had carried my body on his shoulders. Every house I built was a silent monument to compassion. I attended church. I helped neighbors. I never complained of pain, even when my leg hurt so much I could barely sleep, because Hans had endured pain. Hans had carried my wounded weight for kilometers, so my small pains were nothing. It was the price of the life he had given me. People knew me as a fair man, honorable, quiet. No one knew I was living for 2, that every act of kindness was a payment on a debt that transcended death, war, continents. 70 years. 70 years living like this. 70 years guarding Hans like a sacred secret in my chest. Why did I never try to find him? That's the question that devours me now. Why, with all the technology that emerged, letters, telephones, the internet, did I never try to look for Hans in Berlin? Because I was afraid of finding out he was dead. That everything I had built, this entire life of gratitude, had been built on the memory of a man who no longer existed. Afraid that 70 years of silent devotion would collapse in a second. And there was another fear, deeper. The fear that if I found Hans, he would no longer be the man I knew. That the war had changed him completely. That the soldier who had knelt in the snow, who had shared his vodka, who had kissed my forehead like a brother, that this man had disappeared, consumed by time and guilt. So I lived in a limbo, grateful, but alone with my gratitude. Nina knew I had secrets, but she respected my silence. My children thought I was just reserved, a man who had seen too much, a veteran with invisible scars. They didn't know I was living for a ghost. They didn't know that every night before falling asleep, I would whisper in Russian, "Thank you, Hans. I am still living. I am still living for us both." But the ghost had a face and a name, and as I would discover in October 2014, a heart that was still beating in Berlin. In October 2014, a mailman rang my doorbell with a letter that came from Berlin. With handwriting I recognized immediately, despite 70 years. Handwriting that said, "Dear Jakob." My hand trembled as I opened the envelope. 70 years. 70 years waiting for that man. And when he finally arrived, he arrived on paper, in ink, in words I couldn't even fully touch for fear they would disappear. The handwriting was Hans's. I recognized it, though weaker now, more hesitant, as if he'd had to stop several times while writing, as if every word cost him something he no longer had to give. "Dear Jacob," it began. Just that, and I began to cry. He told me he had survived, that he was alive all this time, that he became a history professor in Berlin, history, teaching about the past so as not to repeat its mistakes, I suppose. That he had looked for me in the 1950s, that he had found records that a Jakob had emigrated to Brazil, that he tried several times, but was always afraid. Afraid of what? He didn't say, but I understood. Afraid that I would hate him, afraid that I wouldn't want to hear from him. And then he began to confess. I read the passage 3 times, 4, waiting for the words to change, to turn into something I could bear. They didn't change. Hans had been assigned to mass executions in February 1944. Soviet prisoners, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. He writes about it with a precision that makes me feel it physically, as if I were there in that ditch, in that pre-dawn light, with the rifle shaking in his hands. And then he writes a name, David Sokolov, my brother. The words don't make sense for a few seconds. My brain refuses to accept it. My body refuses to accept it. It's as if someone had placed a bomb inside me that takes a moment to explode. David was among those prisoners, the hands that saved me in the snow, the hands that brought me water, the hands that kissed my forehead like a brother. Those same hands had, I can't write the word. Not even now. 70 years later, and I still can't write the word. Hans explains that he had been assigned, as if the word assigned could dilute responsibility into bureaucracy, as if the word could matter when you're holding a rifle pointed at a man's head. And then he writes something that brings me to my knees. I saved you as an attempt at redemption, Jakob. I knew orders were coming. I knew executions were being ordered. And I thought that if I saved one life, maybe I could make up for the lives I would have to take. As if death and life could be balanced on a moral scale. Redemption. He had saved me to redeem himself, not because he was a good man, not because he saw in me a humanity that deserved to live, but because there was death on his hands and more death to come, and I was the price of his anticipated remorse. The gratitude that had sustained my entire life, 70 years of silent devotion, collapsed. It turned into something that had no name. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't simple. It was the discovery that everything you built was built on a lie that both sides believed to be true. I reread the letter. I tore up the letter. I taped the letter back together, because it was the only thing Hans had left of himself. And then I got to the end. Hans wrote that he was dying. Cancer. 6 months. Maybe less. That he didn't have much time. That he had spent his entire life looking for David, trying to find out what had happened to him, trying to make up for the uncompensatable, that he had spent his fortune on research, that he had created a foundation to honor Soviet prisoners of war, that he had dedicated his entire life to the redemption of a moment that lasted seconds. And now he was dying, with his guilt intact, with his remorse intact. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not exactly. He was saying goodbye. He was leaving a moral testament and hoping that I could somehow turn his confession into something that could be lived with. My hands were shaking. My heart was breaking and reassembling itself simultaneously. How is it possible to love someone you should hate? The letter stayed on the table for days. I couldn't touch it again. I couldn't put it away. I couldn't destroy it. It just sat there, a silent witness to a truth that didn't fit inside me. Weeks passed. I didn't answer. How could I? What words exist for that? Thank you for saving me, but I hate you for killing my brother. I forgive you, but I will never forget. There was no language for this impossibility, so I started to research. I went to the library. I looked in the war archives, Soviet documents, lists of prisoners, lists of executions, and I found it. David Sokolov, executed on February 8, 1944, near Stalingrad. The date destroyed me. February 8th. Hans had saved me on February 1st. Just 7 days. 7 days between my salvation and David's death. 1 week. Hans had carried me on his shoulders on a Monday, and the following Monday, he had... I couldn't complete the thought. I tried to imagine the scene. Hans with his rifle, his hands shaking. Because he would shake, wouldn't he? He would shake because he wasn't a natural killer. He was a man who had kissed my forehead, a man who had shared photos of his mother, a man who... But his hands hadn't shaken enough to refuse the order. I started screaming when I was alone in the house. My daughter lives a few blocks away. She would come to visit and find the living room destroyed, chairs overturned, broken glass, the table where the letter still rested covered in marks from my fists. I had punched the wall until my knuckles bled, as if I could punch through the wall and reach 1944, as if I could undo what Hans had done. "Dad," my daughter would say, holding my face. "What is happening? Please, tell me." But how could I explain? How could I say, "The man who saved me killed your uncle"? How could I translate 70 years of gratitude turned to ash? "It's just memories," I would lie. "The war, it comes back sometimes." She didn't believe me, but she also didn't press. I reread the letter every night, looking for something, a word, a sentence, something that could justify it, something that could explain how a man could be both savior and murderer, redeemer and executioner. Hans had written, "I tried to save as many as I could." What did that mean? That he had saved some and killed others? That he had chosen who would live and who would die based on what? Luck? Selective compassion? I wanted to hate him completely. I needed to hate him. Because hating him would be simple. Hating would be fair. Hating would be an emotion I could carry without contradiction. But I couldn't. Because the memory of the water remained. The memory of the hug remained. The memory of a man kneeling in the snow, choosing compassion when he could have chosen protocol, all of it remained intact, impossible to delete, impossible to reconcile with the man who had killed David. I started to have dreams, not nightmares, dreams where Hans and David were together, talking, laughing, as if they were friends. And I would wake up screaming because the dream was obscene, because my brain was trying to create a reality where they could both coexist, and they couldn't. I spent 2 months like that. 2 months of consuming rage. 2 months of not being able to eat properly. 2 months of losing weight my 95-year-old body couldn't afford to lose. My daughter threatened to take me to the doctor. I refused. How could a doctor cure this? And then, in December 2014, I received a telegram. A telegram from Berlin. Short, direct, no frills. Hans Müller passed away on December 3rd. Our condolences. Last wish. Deliver documents to Jakob Sokolov. He had died. Hans was dead. He died without my answer. Died without knowing if I had forgiven him. Died without confrontation, without resolution, without the chance to look me in the eyes and see what? Hatred, love, both simultaneously. I held the telegram with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. And for the first time since the letter had arrived, I cried. Not from anger, from loss. Because even knowing what Hans had done, even carrying the hatred for David's murder, I had lost my German brother, and now he was dead. And I could never ask the questions I needed to ask. But the telegram mentioned something else. Last wish. Deliver documents to Jakob Sokolov. The documents arrived in January 2015, a heavy package, sealed, with my name written in Hans's handwriting, that same handwriting that had shaken in all the letters, but here it seemed firmer, as if he had reserved his last strength to write my name. Opening that package was like opening a tomb. There were photographs, documents, and a letter with instructions. Open only after my death. Hans had planned this. He had left this saved as a final gift, or a final confession. I still didn't know which. I read the letter with shaking hands. Hans wrote that he had falsified records, prisoner records, transfer records, and David, my David, had not been executed. At least not by Hans's hands. Hans had forged documents, putting David on a transfer list to another camp, a camp 300 kilometers away. David had lived. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to process it. Dozens of prisoners. Hans had saved dozens of prisoners by forging documents. He had put himself at mortal risk. If discovered, he would have been executed. Not just punished, executed. And he had done it. Repeatedly. For months. Hans had spent his entire life looking for David. Trying to find him. Tracking prisoner records. Researching emigrations. Spending his fortune on private investigators, dedicating every waking moment to locating a man he had saved in the darkness of 1944. He never managed to find him alive, but he had discovered something. David had survived the war. He was alive in 1947. He had emigrated to Argentina with the forged documentation Hans had created. He had been given a new name, a new life. He had worked as a mechanic, married, had children, 14 years. David lived for 14 years after the war. 14 years he never would have had without Hans's hands forging documents in the darkness of that camp. And then, in 1958, David had died. A work accident. Something stupid. Common. A man who survived the war, who fled execution, who rebuilt a life on a distant continent, died because a machine failed on an ordinary workday. 14 years. That's all Hans had managed to get for David. But it was 14 years. I fell to my knees. I couldn't breathe. My David had lived. He had been alive the whole time I believed he was dead. Had Hans lied to me? No. Hans had written the truth. A truth I had misinterpreted. When Hans confessed about the executions, I had assumed David was among the dead. But Hans had never said that explicitly. He just left the conclusion open to interpretation. Why? Because Hans gave me time. 7 decades. 7 decades to live, to build, to raise children and grandchildren. And during that time, Hans carried the knowledge that David had lived, that David had had a life, that Hans's sacrifices had a real consequence. There were more documents, photographs. David in Buenos Aires. David with a woman I assumed was his wife. David with children who were my nephews. Nephews I had never met, who I didn't even know existed. And then the 3rd letter. It was inside an older envelope. Yellowed. The handwriting was different, young, desperate, and signed, David, written in 1947, never sent, kept by Hans for 67 years. I opened it carefully, as if it could break, as if the handwriting of my dead, no, living brother could disappear if I touched it too roughly. My dear Jacob, it began. His handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The same handwriting I had seen in letters I received as a child. The same handwriting from our mother's letters, which also had the same slant. David wrote, "I don't know if you are still alive. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. A German soldier, Hans. He saved me. He forged my documents. He put me on a list that said I had died. And then he did the same for dozens of other men. He told me you had been rescued, that you were alive somewhere in the world, and he made me promise something, that if I survived, if I found freedom, I would live well, that I would live as if you were living through me. That is exactly what I am doing, my brother. I am living well, I am working, I am building a life that a German man who didn't know me believed I deserved. If you are reading this, know that Hans is a good man, a man who proved that humanity is possible even in war, a man who chose compassion when it was easier to choose protocol, and know that I have forgiven him for whatever he did and for whatever he was forced to do. Forgive him too, Jacob. Forgiveness is the only luxury that surviving soldiers can afford. With love, David." I held the letter to my chest and cried. 70 years. 70 years living to honor Hans's sacrifice. And the truth was that Hans had sacrificed much more than I had understood. He had sacrificed his soul to save dozens of lives, my brother among them. David had already forgiven, a long time ago, in 1947, while he was still alive. And now it was up to me. David's letter was in my hand. 70 years. 70 years since David had written it. And I was reading it as if it were the first time I was hearing his voice. Because it was. Because David had died in 1958 and I had never known he was alive to die. I reread every word, slowly, as if I could extract more meaning from each letter. David wrote about the night Hans saved him. He described being in a line of the condemned, men waiting for execution, and Hans had appeared. He had whispered in his ear, "You have a brother, Jakob. He was rescued days ago. He is alive. You can be alive too." How did Hans know? It doesn't matter. He knew because he had talked to me, because he had heard my name whispered in the darkness of that cellar, because he had turned information into hope, and he had given that hope to David. David wrote, "When Hans put me on that list, when he forged my documents, he whispered again, 'Your brother lived because I chose compassion. Now you will live too. You will live for us both.' Hans had given David the same charge he had given me, to live for two. To live because someone had chosen to sacrifice their soul so we could live. And David had tried to find me. He searched records, wrote letters that were never answered, tried to track my trail. But I had disappeared into the vastness of Brazil. And David had given up. Or maybe he had learned to live without confirming I existed. Maybe that was enough, knowing that Hans believed I was alive. So David lived. He met a woman named Rosa. They married. They had children. Names I don't recognize. Names that are my nephews. My nephews I never met. Who don't know they had an uncle in South America who had spent 70 years living for the sacrifice of a German soldier. But there was more in David's letter. David wrote that he had found out things about Hans, that he had learned Hans kept looking for him after the war, that Hans had spent money on researchers, that Hans had created a foundation to honor Soviet prisoners of war. David wrote, "Hans lives with guilt, but it's not just guilt for what he did. It's guilt for what he couldn't do. He saved some, hundreds, maybe, but he couldn't save everyone, and that destroys him. If you ever find Jakob, my dear friend, tell him that I forgave him. Not because Hans did everything right. No one can do everything right in war. Tell him I forgave him because he chose compassion when it was easier to choose protocol. Because he gave me 14 years. 14 years my brother could never have imagined I would have. Tell him the war is over, that for those of us who live, forgiveness is the only way forward." 14 years. David had lived for 14 years because Hans had risked everything. 14 years to build a life, to marry, to have children, to work, to exist, to be a man instead of a prisoner. And then in 1958, on an ordinary day, David had died. In an accident. The machine had failed, fate had decided, and David was gone. But his letter remained, kept by Hans, protected, waiting for the right moment, the moment when I could receive it. I held the letter against my heart, and I understood something that had taken me 70 years to understand. David had already forgiven. Long before I even knew David was alive. Long before I received Hans's letter. Long before the explosion of rage that had destroyed my home and my heart. David had looked at Hans in that dark camp in 1944. He had looked at a man with a rifle, a man who could have killed him, a man who was the enemy, and he had seen humanity, and he had forgiven. And so David had left this letter, not as an accusation, as a release. Forgive him too, Jakob. Forgiveness is the only luxury that surviving soldiers can afford. My brother, who had lived 14 years that I had lost, had left me instructions, not as an order, as an invitation, as the hand of someone who had already learned to walk through the darkness, reaching back to pull me through too. For the first time in 70 years I understood. Forgiveness wasn't my decision. It had already been decided, a long time ago, by a man who had forged documents, by a brother who had written a letter that would never be sent, by voices from the past that whispered, "Live in peace, live well, live because we died, so that you could." And now it was just up to me to accept what had been offered. 70 years later, I can finally breathe. I am sitting in the same armchair, the same room, the same clock that has marked every second of my life built on a secret. But something has changed. I have changed. Not because I'm aging is just time passing, but because I finally understand. The letters are beside me, from Hans, from David. Documents that prove my entire life was built on a lie that turned out to be true. It's strange to say that. It's even stranger to live with it. Hans had spent 70 years trying to make up for crimes he himself questioned if he had truly committed. Executions that were ordered. Lives he couldn't save. But while he was trying to compensate for death, he had created life. He had forged documents. He had saved my brother. He had saved dozens of others. And he had saved me. And I had lived this entire life, marriage, children, grandchildren, a career built with dignity, because I believed I was indebted to a man who had chosen compassion when it was easier to choose protocol. The irony now is so clear it hurts. We both lived lies that made us better. Hans lived with guilt that turned him into a professor, into someone who dedicated his life to teaching that every life matters. That humanity is possible even in war. That compassion is a choice, and I lived with gratitude that turned me into a man of honor, who never complained, who helped neighbors, who built houses, who raised children who know how to love, who lived with dignity because he believed he was living for two. Hans's redemption didn't come from trying to make up for the death he caused. It came from saving the life that I lived. And that life, lived with integrity, with purpose, with the secret knowledge that every moment was a gift. That life was the greatest gift he could have given me. I hold David's letter again, and I cry, but not from anger, from relief, because I finally understand. I have forgiven Hans, but I discovered that Hans forgave me first. He forgave me for living. He forgave me for building something beautiful from his sacrifice. He forgave me for not understanding, for 70 years, what he had truly done. David had already forgiven us both, a long time ago, when he was placed in a death line and a man in a German uniform whispered, "You can be alive too." And now, at 95, I can finally let this letter rest. I can let Hans rest. I can let David rest. And maybe, finally, I can rest too. It's not easy to tell this. I've kept this story for so long that it's become part of my bones. But I need you to understand something. This isn't fiction. It's not something I read. It happened to me. It happened to Hans. It happened to David. And there's a question I leave with you, because maybe it's the question that really matters. If someone saved your life, if someone carried your wounded weight for kilometers in the darkness, if someone chose compassion when it was easier to choose death, could you forgive everything that came after? Could you understand that humanity is more complicated than good and evil? That sometimes the savior and the murderer are the same person? Because that is true forgiveness. It isn't forgetting. It's understanding. It's accepting that war warps us all, and that what saves us isn't the absence of error. It's the choice to live well despite them. I chose to live well. Hans chose to live well. And David, before he left, asked only one thing of us: that we live in peace. 70 years later, I can finally obey him.